Episode 74, 18th Century Colonial Eggs and Associated Chicken Facts. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the state of eggs and chickens in the 18th century colonies. Like milk, these were women's work, but boy oh boy did they keep better than milk, which means keeping eggs was going to start being a thing. Chickens also become more interesting this century, but largely for non-food reasons, which is weird when you consider these colonies were mainly built for food production, after all. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that until the 20th century, eggs were a seasonal crop. Just like peaches or salmon or green beans, there was a time of year eggs were around, and then much of the year they were rare or simply not available at all. To be fair, this seems obvious when you consider European and North American birds generally, but I, like most people alive here in the 21st century, have never lived in a place where chicken eggs were like that. Most birds in most places lay eggs once for the breeding season, and then that's it for the year. But chickens, we've messed around with chickens and helped them evolve into crazed egg layers. I mean, think about it. For those of us who have watched some nature shows over the years, we know it makes no sense for a bird to lay more eggs than the number of baby birds they can care for. And this matters more for those kinds of birds that hatch the blind, naked, flightless, immobile baby birds. The technical term is atricial. Those parents have to go get worms or bugs or rodents or nectar or whatever and haul groceries back to the nest for a few weeks. Too many helpless babies would literally kill a parent bird. Chickens and ducks and such, precocial birds, hatch with feathers and the ability to get up and go and feed themselves pretty quick. And yes, this is related to the word precocious, the word that gets used for kids that seem to be way ahead of their peers in something, like vocabulary, climbing, chess, or finding Sharpie pens and getting the cap off. Too many babies is less of a problem for precocial birds because while the parents have to expend energy to lay them, hatch them, and guard them, they aren't completely wearing themselves out in the same way to feed totally helpless babies. So while a robin or a hummingbird or an eagle has important reasons to only produce 2 or 3 eggs, it does make a certain amount of sense that chickens and turkeys and ostriches and other birds like them don't limit egg production in the same way. And because these largely flightless birds of limited aggression could be easily caught and kept, we've messed about with chickens over the last few thousand years in ways that make them lay far, far more eggs than they could reasonably ever need. Part of this is certainly our human habit of taking eggs away. Lots of birds will start over and lay more eggs if they lose them before they hatch. But there is a limit. No hummingbird is ever going to be able to lay even a dozen eggs if they keep disappearing. So back to our chickens and their eggs. By the 18th century, just as with other farmyard things, the rise of scientific thinking about breeding animals had reached the yard birds. The scrawny birds that had come over in the 17th century had expanded their range alongside the people. The cow trade had expanded, more milk was about, more pigs were in pens getting salted and turned into sausage, and in these same farmyards there were more and more chickens. And since more and more villages were growing up with groups of people, just the way good milkers in cows were starting to get cultivated, sweet dessert apples were being grafted and passed along, good layers were being noted in the chickens. Even at the start of the colonies, there were a decent variety of chickens to work with. There is a bit of murkiness regarding the exact sources of early chickens in the Americas because they were just so ubiquitous. Nobody really closely tracked, say, ship rats or ship chickens. Both were just assumed to be there. Definitely a case of not writing down what everybody knows. So while exact details are fuzzy, trends and general timing is clear. Chickens were brought to the Caribbean, if not by Columbus, then by voyages that followed soon after. It wasn't so much in the mode of purposely adding chickens, it was just that any decent ship had chickens on board. Even indecent ships had chickens on board. Domestic chickens were also a feature of West African farmyards, and many a slaver ship would have a cage of chickens on deck. And so West African chickens would also find themselves dropped off in Brazil, New Spain, and the Caribbean. But as with archaeology in corn, tobacco, yams, and tomatoes, it may be that the story is stranger than we think. Was South America where chickens met themselves again? There seems to be reasonable evidence to suggest that the same contact between Polynesian voyagers that resulted in the spreading of sweet potatoes from South America into the Pacific archipelago might have introduced the domesticated chicken from Pacific Islanders into South America. While it's unclear from the piles of old chicken bones in city middens right now, there is a reasonable possibility this occurred. Regardless, even if the colonies only had chickens brought from Portugal, Spain, Ghana, Nigeria, Angola, and England and Holland, but none from Polynesia, that's still a pretty good starter set to begin with, in order to avoid any founder effects and allow for the choosing of and breeding for desirable traits. And if you spend any time with chickens, you'll know they're much easier to handle, transport, and trade than pigs and cows. Hilariously loud if you sneak up on them, but much easier to deal with. That said, a single chicken was impressive if it produced 50 eggs in a laying season. By comparison, a modern chicken under modern feeding and lighting conditions might produce up to 300. The mind boggles. This also makes clear that no one kept just one chicken, and if they were keeping chickens, they might also be keeping other birds. Ducks or turkeys as well. Some of the fancy birds we have now, like guinea hens, pheasants, or quail, those would never have been kept in a yard. Those were wild birds to be hunted. In fact, most of the bird flesh eaten in the colonies in both the 18th as well as the 17th century was from wild birds. Unlike the 21st century chicken, which never makes it to even 3 months old if it's a meat bird, and never to 3 years old if it's a layer, most colonial chickens hung around for several years. Okay, likely a few roosters became the proverbial spring chickens that graced a table, because farmers had limited needs for roosters. Yes, a few tough roosters to defend the flock of hens and keep the flock going, sure, but not approximately half of all the chickens. I mean, no one really had a need for surplus roosters. Okay, except for the cockfight promoters. They had a use for extra, otherwise unemployed roosters. Fun fact, cockfighting was definitely an enjoyed pastime at this point in colonial history. Bull and bear baiting might have been quite the popular spectacle in London, but those require infrastructure and a critical mass of paying customers that the colonies couldn't provide at this time. But cockfighting, now that can take place just about anywhere, and the overhead is extremely low. Cockfighting would continue as entertainment in the U.S. for over 200 years, with Louisiana being the last state to outlaw it in 2008. So yeah, most colonial chickens had the opportunity to hang about for longer than the modern farm chicken. In the wild, Gallus gallus, the jungle fowl Gallus domestica was evolved from, lives for about 2 to 3 years. I mean, jungle life is tough on a chicken, but those farmyard chickens, at least the ones that were protected from foxes, wolves, coyotes, raccoons, snakes, wildcats of many sorts, and all manner of weasels, not to mention a variety of predatory birds, eagles, hawks, and the occasional kite and osprey, those birds could easily live to about 5 years old. Incidentally, the phrase chicken hawk comes from the epithet thrown at hawks by farm wives berating birds hunting these generally defenseless chickens. Sure, they were doing hawk stuff, but on the easiest targets possible. Contemptible. As for the modern, pampered backyard chickens that even get trips to the vet, these can live up to 10 years, but that would be odd in the 18th century, even if they were a fancy bird. Fancy birds, you ask? What do I mean by that? Well, just as flowers were becoming fancy, and botany and flower breeding, trading, and cultivation was growing in the 18th century garden that was now a source of delight, fancy chickens were proliferating in the realm of the emerging gentleman farmers. flower seeds and cuttings were relatively easy to transport and made the spread of Chinese garden flowers to England, English flowers to the colonies, and colonial flowers back out to the rest of the world pretty simple. The spread of flowers has been traced not only in letters and journals where such seed exchanges were recorded, but also in numerous watercolor and ink paintings, which were done by every upper and even middle class lady, along with the better recognized male botanists in their catalogs, as well as in still lifes and portraits of the age. And just as flowers were spreading, so were fancy chickens. The same chicken characteristics that made cockfighting popular, the birds were portable, easy to feed, they just need some grain and food scraps and a bit of water, also made them nearly as easy to transport as fancy flower material. Fancy chicken breeding, like fancy flower breeding, had been a pastime in China. Just check out the 17th and 18th century pottery and ink paintings. So chickens, along with tea and porcelain and the flowers, easily traveled to Europe and the New World. As a result, the everywhere and always underfoot chicken suddenly became a pet, an item for social discourse, and a bit of showing off. There is not currently a lot of discussion of the fancy chickens in modern scholarship, but since painting of the pastoral scene, especially as background and setting of full-length portraiture, and in the emerging genre of naturalistic painting was becoming popular, an awful lot of painted chickens are to be found in the paintings of the age. So why, you ask, was this style of naturalistic and somewhat from life painting style getting more popular, especially over the very rigid and formal and explicitly symbolic painting that had come before? In part because there were more people who had bigger houses. All the new wealth that was being extracted from these new 17th and 18th century overseas colonies meant more houses. The arrival of all sorts of new building materials from North and South American trees meant houses could be built bigger for cheaper. That, along with all the American iron being made into nails, meant there were a lot of new bare walls. Tapestries were expensive and time-consuming, and let's face it, a bit dated as decor in the 18th century. But colonial products not only meant more fortunes and houses, it also meant more art materials. Wood for canvas frames or boards to paint on were cheaper. The import of more cloth materials and emerging technology brought down the price of cloth generally, which included the sort of canvas used for paintings. Plant and tree-based substances used for thinning, stabilizing, and fixing paint were also produced in greater amounts, again, bringing down the cost of paints or paint ingredients. And then there's this rising of chemistry out of alchemy, which allows for the creation and selling of all sorts of new pigments, in addition to the mineral sources of other pigments being mined in the colonies around the world. Where I'm getting with my diversion into how colonialism affected the economics of art is that the proliferation in fancy chicken breeding is partially preserved in time by the growth and spread of painting techniques, painting pigments, painting materials, and the desire for more paintings. It also didn't hurt that there was a growing affection for the painting of subjects to be found on the farmyard. As wealthy people were spending more time indoors, especially women, and as they were spending more time in cities, they began to look back on their days in the country of being real farmers, or at least living surrounded by farms, with those rose-colored glasses of distance. So were chicken paintings the giant pickup truck in the driveway of their day? I don't know. But the nostalgia for the good old days, when things were pure and better, yes, that was already a thing in the 18th century. Even they were already forgetting all the things about 17th century farm life that made people strive to, well, leave 17th century farm life. And if you're questioning whether, really, chickens in paintings? Consider the rise of boys being painted with their pet deer, the American and European affection for including pets in their pictures, and of course the genre of horse paintings, used to preserve and show off favorite or legendary horses. So yes, fancy chickens were traded and bred for their fancy plumage, and they were also painted, either alone or as part of other pictures to record their remarkable plumage. You can see this habit of including chickens just by looking at any number of pastoral paintings in a museum or even on your phone. Simply search for 18th century chicken art on an internet near you. Even today, you can hear the, quote, Oriental and exotic, unquote, origins in heritage chicken breed names, like Nankins, from the city of Nanking, now known as Nanjing, or Silky, originally known as the Chinese silk chicken for its super fluffy soft feathers that were like silk. Under its gray or white feathers, the Silky has black skin, bluish gray meat, and dark gray bones, making it a less common chicken for the table. Developing showy breeds was a way for a landowner to make a name for himself. Granted, the guy writing about and trading on the new bird's fame was rarely working the chicken yards, but as the owner of the property and perhaps the bird keepers, he was the one credited with the development of the bird. Many of today's fancy and heritage chicken breeds trace themselves back to breeding programs in Holland, Spain, Portugal, France, and Italy, along with the colonial New World, and even to the chicken yards of one of the splashiest 18th century monarchs, Catherine the Great. Chicken breeding for flash was certainly a widespread pastime. But back to the eggs. It wasn't just the rich guys with bare walls that needed to be filled up who were thinking about chicken breeding. There were also people more concerned about eggs. And this is where keeping not only several chickens, but several kinds of chickens or poultry birds comes up. The fact that different sorts of chickens acted differently, especially about their eggs, was noted. Some breeds were known to be good mothers or broody, while others were good layers but incredibly neglectful of eggs. Also, waterfowl, ducks, and geese can be the pits when it comes to laying eggs in places where they get all eaten up by weasels and raccoons and such. And this is where some interesting mixing and matching of breeds and birds would happen in a farmyard. Chicken breeds that are neglectful of their eggs being better layers makes sense. They aren't so hot at keeping those eggs and possibly even the chicks particularly safe, so they only survive by getting lots of eggs out there, which for the purpose of collecting eggs is great news. There's not so much fighting off of protective hens. However, since these chickens don't live forever, see above, it would be nice if there was a more dependable way to make sure these good layers but lousy mothers could more dependably make it from fertilized egg to a new laying hen. And that's where the broody breeds come in. The term broody refers to a hen's habit of wanting to guard or sit atop her clutch of eggs and brood them. Some types of hen will not only sit atop her own eggs, but will add in other eggs or even other objects into her nest and attempt to hatch them. These protective and broody habits also made for a collection of good news, bad news outcomes. Yes, these breeds had better than average survival rates of their chicks, but they were a pain to collect eggs from. In fact, the broody nature often meant that once they had decided to work on hatching a batch of eggs, they simply stopped laying for the season. In other words, I'm hatching now, so I'm done laying. On the other hand, they were so into this sitting on eggs, turning the eggs, looking after the eggs, even adopting eggs, meant that these sorts of hens were great for hatching eggs from the good layers, but bad brooders varieties of chickens. They were even handy for hatching baby ducks if a poultry keeper didn't want to worry about more typical duck egg and duckling predators. That's right. Part of having a variety of chickens on the farm is because even they had different jobs. Look pretty, lay eggs, hatch eggs, you understand. But the eggs themselves, they were also an interesting thing. Just like the pigs and cows and goats and stuff, even though chicken as a meat wasn't common, it was more common than in England generally. And eating eggs, that was a favorite thing in England and in the colonies alike. And just as with so much other food, more people further down the social scale could eat eggs more often than the approximately same people in England. Mainly because, once again, more people had more land, so anyone keeping chickens was likely able to keep more chickens than their counterpart back in England. There was simply more space. And 3 50 eggs a year chickens is going to be a whole different thing than keeping 10 or 20 50 eggs a year chickens. And with all that extra room to keep chickens, dig cellars, wells, and eventually build and stock ice houses, the technology for keeping eggs around started to develop in earnest. People have been keeping eggs for weeks or months for absolutely ages, but again, this was largely a rich man's game, because they were the only people likely to have excess eggs. But in the colonies, with more eggs for more chickens on more farms, it was time to figure out how to keep eggs for longer. It was understood that eggs have to have some mechanism for keeping good for a period of time. I mean, chicks take about 21 days to hatch, and they don't hatch from rotten eggs. They also recognized that eggs that are too cold took longer to hatch, so cooling should be useful in preserving unfertilized eggs. It was also known that eggs kept for a while can dry out, not like dehydrate into powder, just lose moisture. Now this can be useful. Burying eggs in salt makes them thicken and stay not rotten, because all the salt keeps the bacteria out that could make an egg go rotten. But the different texture of a salted egg is not useful for most baking. But this ability to dry out did lead people to start playing around with the understanding that the egg needed to be covered or coated in something that defended it from water loss, even if they didn't know about microscopic pores. Because in the age of so much seafaring and important written documents, people already understood one way or another about the idea of waterproof. So methods of coating eggs in fat, or pitch, or types of varnish were used to preserve eggs. Burying them in wet sand, sealing them somehow, and then submerging them in water, especially cold water, was also used. The submerging eggs in liquid to preserve them will be the one that emerges as the favorite, and the one that develops the most over time. I mean, fat was just too precious to be used that way too much, and sticky things on the shells of eggs made using the eggs kind of a pain. But there was definitely experimentation with preserving eggs so they could travel and be traded. Moving eggs around started to become important as more people, especially wealthier people, started to move into cities. North American cities tended not to have lots of city chickens, much in the same way they didn't have city pigs. But they did like their tavern meals of eggs and bacon and coffee. So along with the butchers buying pig quarters and hung hams and smoked bacon to sell to the townhouses, market stalls would also have eggs for sale. And having eggs available in the non-egg times, that is winter and early spring, would fetch an especially favorable price. So figuring out ways to preserve eggs so eggs would be available for Christmas cake, now that would be an excellent thing indeed. In the 18th century, we don't have an egg industry yet, but definitely the seeds are planted. And the interest in developing desirable chicken breeds is there, whether fancy or practical, along with laying down the rules of what a hearty American breakfast will come to be. Seriously, having 2 different proteins in one meal was an extraordinarily extravagant thing. And for it to be available at a tavern to pretty regular people marks the American diet as something new under the sun. Well, we've covered most of the common barnyard meat sources, except for one, the horse. Definitely the trickiest American meat of this period to cover, but cover it I will. Us moderns have a tricky relationship with the horse, but the colonial one is pretty straightforward. If anything, it is about as balanced as it is ever going to be. That's right, it's time to look at the state of the 18th century colonial horse. Thanks for listening. It would be a big help for reaching more listeners if you could leave a review of this podcast on your favorite podcast widget. And thank you again for those that have. I'm enjoying hearing from people on social media as well, especially the questions and pointers to sources that they have enjoyed. And any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with promised pictures and links, I will eventually include any interesting media I consumed for this episode. Sorry, I'm behind again, but at least the shows are still coming out. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the links to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter, Insta, and post.news bio at THOA Food, and in the show description.